What if I told you that your favourite game is repetitive? You might become defensive, and honestly I'd have a hard time blaming you. Calling something repetitive is widely seen as a negative. The problem is people will often treat the words repetitive and monotonous as the same thing, but they're not. I think it's important to distinguish that monotony is often a product of repetition, but repetition doesn't always lead to monotony. After all, one is an objective truth, the other an entirely subjective opinion. We as a species, believe it or not, actually enjoy repetition. Most of us will repeat the same rituals every day, not because we have to, but because we find a certain level of comfort by indulging in what feels familiar. If something were to offset that repetition, it can really affect our equilibrium. Therefore, it shouldn't really come as much of a surprise to anyone that game developers will try and prey on this human characteristic. But I think developers have something that can be best described as a love-hate relationship with repetition. Ideally, what they want is for their game to be incredibly repetitive, but for nobody to actually notice. Let's just think of it from a production perspective. Creating a game with 3 or 4 core mechanics that the player enjoys repeating is an incredibly cost-effective approach to game design. Whereas the alternative would be that the game houses a wide selection of mechanics, only for the majority to be left untouched. Now of course, if it is in the developer's best interest to disguise repetition, then frankly Avalanche Studios, the developers behind Mad Max, did a piss poor job. But that's exactly what makes Mad Max so fascinating. Unlike most games that go to great lengths to try and mask their repetitive nature, Mad Max wears its heart on its sleeve. The game is built upon 4 main pillars as its foundation: vehicles, hand-to-hand combat, exploration, and scavenging. Mad Max is a perfect example of a game that was unfairly dismissed, with so many reviewers brandishing its core gameplay loop as being repetitive. Let's break down these 4 pillars and find out why, despite a game being marred by its label of repetition, Mad Max is a game that fans keep coming back to. Avalanche Studios made a name for themselves with their Just Cause franchise, a franchise well known for their overall premise of inciting all manner of wanton destruction. Explosions and chaos are what make up the vast majority of each entry, and if mindless mayhem is what you seek, you can't really go far wrong. But if you're after a strong basis for exceptionally well designed car handling, Just Cause wouldn't be among the games I would recommend. I've once heard it described feeling less like you're driving a vehicle over terrain, and more like you're moving terrain under a vehicle. Obviously incremental improvements have been made to the series as it's matured, but it's no secret that the vast majority of gameplay takes place above ground and not on it. Ahead of picking up Mad Max a few months post-launch, and after having played all 3 of the Just Cause entries, this was a concern of mine. A centralised theme of Mad Max was always going to be around driving cars, and with Avalanche's pedigree, it didn't really ignite much confidence. Thankfully, this lack of confidence was misplaced. Driving the magnum opus is exhilarating, not only by how well it responds to player inputs, but also the outstanding audio and visuals that complement it. The attention to detail even from an idle vehicle is almost as intoxicating as tearing through the wasteland at blistering speeds. The ignited trail of the fuel pipe, the heat emanating off the V8 engine, Chum Bucket fidgeting in the back as he worships the Lady Combustion, everything adds to the atmosphere. But of course the orchestra swells when things are in motion. Hurtling through the dried up seabeds of Australia is an immense feeling, and for any game to convey a sense of speed in enormous open areas is far from easy, but Mad Max manages to transfer the feeling impeccably well, both with effective post-processing effects as well as the scream of the engine. When that speed is polarised against the immediacy of slamming our vehicle into another, it almost feels like we'll fly through the windscreen ourselves. Avalanche did an outstanding job at providing us with the most rudimentary of toolsets for us to cause such calamitous destruction. What's amazing is when we boil it down to the fundamental parts, it reveals itself to be little more than smashing 2 inanimate objects together just like when we were kids. But of course, the vehicle isn't the only place where we can incite violence. When we aren't travelling at breakneck speeds in the wasteland, there's a good chance we'll be breaking necks at speed when deploying Max's addictive combat abilities. The combat system is structured around the free flow mechanics of the Arkham games, making it familiar but not exactly revolutionary. We have our single input for attack, another for counter, and the option to combat roll to evade any of the more deadly enemy maneuvers. While the Arkham games have received high praise over the years, ranking for many as their favourite combat system to date, Mad Max seldom receives the equivalent accolades. Plenty have cast it aside as simply being a cheap knockoff, a poor man's Arkham, regarded as an outright inferior experience. Frankly, I couldn't disagree more. Animations are fluid, feedback is instant, connections are brutal. From time to time we can be caught with our trousers down, but generally enemy attacks are telegraphed, allowing plenty of time to react. An argument can be made that the combat loop therefore feels a little easy, but people often forget that not every game needs to deliver the same level of unforgiving challenge that some franchises are known for. Max will show his capability for taking down a gang of raving lunatics with relative ease, and the feeling of dishing out pain and brutality against our enemies has rarely felt better. Regardless of whether or not we just spent the last 20 minutes beating the sense out of the already senseless, spotting another maniac on the horizon will often lead to a quick diversion just to satiate the bloodlust. Deserts are notorious for being vast empty landscapes with very little diversity with regards to scenery. Pair this with a colour palette dominated by shades of beige and brown, and Avalanche's visuals department faced an immense challenge. Expecting a game in the Mad Max universe to offer diverse locations would perhaps be a little naive. Despite the odds being stacked against them, what Avalanche pulled off was simply stunning. The range that the map is able to offer while remaining true to the IP is nothing short of genius, and it's all done without overindulging in quantity over quality. There's a very fine line between a world that feels expansive and a world that feels empty. Mad Max's open world perfectly sits somewhere in the middle by offering a vast landscape without sacrificing player engagement. There are very few occasions where the player will have nothing to drive them forward to the next destination. It could be spotting our next target through the longlookers, or identifying a distant point of interest. And those points of interest are actually worth visiting. The calamitous events of the apocalypse left civilization in ruins. Both time and the elements have torn apart much of what mankind have built. Each location cries out with stories of survivors scraping together what resources they could just to make it through one more day. The gameplay loop of clearing one location and moving on to the next can lead to the player not really observing their surroundings. But this is a habit that's worth breaking. Taking in the details around some of the camps can reveal some excellent world building, deepening the connection of how incredibly tragic some of the lives of this world are.
Like the very earth was turning on us, killing us.
For a map filled with so many of these camps and outposts, it's easy to assume that the blueprint for one camp would be copied dozens of times, but each and every single camp is a little different from the last. One campsite might reflect the mindset of someone just trying to make ends meet, whereas another camp might reflect complete and utter lunacy. Either way, each camp will provoke us to take part in possibly the biggest culprit for accusations of repetition in the wasteland. If we aren't wreaking havoc by fist or by fuel, then we're probably collecting water. If we're not collecting water, we're likely chowing down on some dog food. If we're not chowing down on some dog food, we're almost certainly collecting scrap. If we're not collecting scrap, we're collecting scrap. And if we're not collecting scrap, we're definitely collecting scrap. If I haven't made my point clear, the wasteland is rich with this resource, it's everywhere. From the small hovels being held together by duct tape and prayers, to the enormous camps bursting with war boys and oil tanks. Simply put, scrap rules the wasteland, and its collection is paramount to progression. There is no shortage of ways to find it either, and it ties in heavily with every one of the main pillars that make up the core gameplay. The construction of the magnum opus hinges on there being enough scrap in our bank. Max's tools and abilities are purchased with scrap as currency. Discovering and clearing camps and outposts hangs on the 100% collection of each ounce of scrap hidden among them. And whichever method is employed for its collection, the picking at the carcass of a vehicle, the corpse of a madman, or the 500th stray scrap pile from one of the many camps, the level of engagement is pretty shallow. Naturally, the balance of easily obtainable wealth and increasingly expensive upgrades will lead to repetition, which, as we've already established, isn't inherently negative. Mad Max makes no effort to hide the repetitive nature of surviving in a callous and unforgiving world. Driving, fighting, exploring, scavenging, each of those four components are what make up the key to enduring a desolate landscape. But it's the continuous push for survival that makes this repetition so compelling. Dismissing a game for being repetitive is easy. There's almost an expectation for developers to constantly think up 100 different ways for a player to remain engaged, when perhaps a more logical solution is to simply create a strong enough foundation that remains compelling to repeat over and over. Maybe a question we should be asking isn't whether or not a game is repetitive, it's whether or not we should care. Nearly a decade has passed since the original release of Mad Max in 2015, and players are still returning to the wasteland to reignite their V8 war machines. They're still not quite done shattering the jaws of warboys, or venturing to the farthest reaches of the dusty dunes. Perhaps they're just looking to reclaim every last inch of scrap to survive the chaos a little longer. Because sometimes repetition isn't a flaw, but instead the exact reason we keep coming back.